Welcome to the Nushi Health Podcast, where we provide credible, no-hype health, wellness, and nutrition information that actually moves the needle towards better long-term health. Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Erin Glenn, host of the Nushi Health Podcast. And in today's episode, we are delving into the fascinating topic of fasting. We'll review the science behind several different approaches to fasting, the general principles of each approach, and we'll look at what health benefits have been shown. We're chopping out all the extra stuff and just focusing on core questions and answers around different types of fasting, the benefits that have been shown, and how to do it. What is fasting? What breaks a fast and what doesn't? Does fasting help you lose weight, lose fat, live longer, improve organ health, help you focus? Do certain types of fasting provide more or greater benefits than others? We will cover different approaches to fasting that offer a variety of benefits so you can decide which option might be a good fit with your lifestyle and needs. Plus, we'll discuss considerations specific to different groups of people, including women and fasting based on hormone fluctuations. What's becoming more clear as the science in this area evolves is that when you eat may be of just as much importance as what you eat. I love this topic of fasting. I think there's so much to learn here, so I'm excited to review this topic with you today. If you're new here, this is the third episode in our series aimed at helping you find your food fit, a plan for how to structure your everyday eating in a way that works with your lifestyle, preferences, health goals, budget, and more. You certainly don't need to have listened to the previous episodes to benefit from today's overview, but the earlier episodes do provide a good foundation of nutrition basics, so check those out if you feel like you need a review or you want to learn more about the Mediterranean, DASH, or MIND diets. Those were covered in episode 2. This series on finding your food fit and all of these eating patterns we're covering is designed to give you a broad overview, to give you the current general scientific consensus on health benefits and safety, and ideas for how you can put the eating pattern into practice. It's not individualized medical or dietary advice, and I am not a medical doctor or a registered dietitian. I do, however, have a PhD in protein metabolism and decades of experience researching nutrition, exercise, and metabolic conditions. So we'll evaluate these different eating patterns from that scientific perspective to help you find a way of eating that works for you and moves the needle towards better long-term health. If you plan on trying out this or any of the other eating patterns we'll discuss in this series, it's important to have a discussion with a qualified healthcare provider about what you plan to do, especially if you're on medications or have an existing medical condition. And of course, do not adjust or stop any medications without the guidance of your healthcare professional. Okay, this topic of fasting and all the different ways one could fast. It's such a vast topic. This could be a multi-hour episode. And indeed, many other podcasts do have multi-hour episodes on fasting. But in an effort to make this information digestible and actionable, we're going to focus the discussion today on the most feasible and the most studied aspects of applying fasting to your everyday life. We're not going to get too bogged down in the potential molecular mechanisms of how fasting works, but I do hope by the end of the episode you understand some broad concepts of what fasting changes in our bodies and why those changes result in the benefits we see. Much of what we know about fasting and specifically time-restricted eating, which we'll define in a moment, has been gleaned from animal studies. And those can tell us a lot and certainly let us dive deeper into understanding the potential mechanisms for why something works. But for the sake of brevity and clarity today, we're going to focus on the human data when we talk about fasting and health benefits. And the last thing before we get into it In doing research for this episode, it became clear to me that some of the fasting protocols out there are not approaches that I think should be promoted to the general public. So I will mention what some of those are, but today's discussion will be focused on fasting approaches that have the most data for health benefits, a good safety margin, and approaches that are going to be a feasible and reasonable option for most people. All right, we're going to start by defining many of the terms that relate to fasting. First, what is fasting? In simplest terms, and what we'll mean when we talk about fasting in today's episode, fasting is voluntarily abstaining from food and beverages that contain calories for a defined amount of time. Based on this definition, you could see there could be many interpretations and variations of fasting, and indeed there are. The strictest would be a dry fast where you consume nothing, no food, no water, nothing, which, to be blunt, is just dangerous. Don't do it unless specifically prescribed by a doctor for some medical reason. Some might ask, what about Ramadan? Let me come back to that in a moment after we get these things defined. Then there's a water-only fast where nothing besides water is allowed for that defined amount of time. Sometimes a water fast can include replenishment of electrolytes too, with the addition of sea salt to the water or an electrolyte supplement. A water-only fast is often required for medical tests and procedures like a blood test or surgery, but often if you're doing a water fast for your own purposes versus as a requirement for a medical procedure, many people allow unsweetened, non-caloric beverages like black coffee and tea to also be consumed in a water-only fast, as long as the beverages don't contain flavor or calories. Then we have intermittent fasting. This is a term that's gained a lot of popularity in recent years. In intermittent fasting, you have a period of eating and a period of not eating or fasting. Intermittent fasting is actually an umbrella term that covers several different approaches. Alternate day fasting, which you'll see abbreviated as ADF, modified alternate day fasting or MADF, the 5-2 diet, and time-restricted eating, which is abbreviated as TRE or sometimes TRF if it's called time-restricted feeding instead of eating. So let's define each of those. Alternate day fasting is what it sounds like. You do a standard fast on one day, only water, unsweetened tea, black coffee. And then you consume your normal diet on the next day, and you just alternate back and forth, fast day, feed day. This approach does have many benefits that we'll discuss, but it can be hard for people to completely fast for an entire day, consuming only that water, coffee, and/or tea. Modified alternate day fasting was designed to make this approach more feasible for people. So in modified alternate day fasting, you can consume 1/4, about 25% of your daily energy needs on your fasting day. If you need about 2,000 calories based on your goals of maintaining or losing body weight, then on your fasting days, you could consume about 500 calories from foods and beverages. And then you'd have a normal eating day the next day. This approach has also evolved into the 5-2 diet, which is even a little easier than modified alternate day fasting. With modified alternate day fasting, you're alternating every other day between the low-calorie fast days and your normal days. But with the 5-2 approach, you only do those low-calorie fasting days twice a week, and the other 5 days of the week you eat normally. Those 2 low-calorie fasting days are not consecutive, so you could do your low-calorie fasting days on Mondays and Thursdays, for instance, and then eat normally the rest of the days of the week. 5 days normal, 2 days at that 25% of your calorie needs. Everyone's calorie needs are different. We posted a YouTube tutorial on how to find your needs if you don't know, but many people, for the sake of ease on this modified alternate day fasting or 5-2 approach, will just say that your fasting day is about 500 calories for women or about 600 calories for men. But if you want to make it more personalized, calculate that as 25% of your daily caloric needs. Okay, so under the intermittent fasting umbrella, we've defined alternate day fasting, modified alternate day fasting, where you can consume some calories on your fasting day, the 5-2 approach, where you do low calorie days twice a week, and the last approach is called time restricted eating, or TRE. With time restricted eating, you are eating every day, and there's no restriction on how many calories you can eat per day. Instead, you're limiting the number of hours, the time in each 24-hour period that you consume calories. So you have an eating window and a fasting window within a 24-hour period, with the fasting window being at least 12 hours to be considered time restricted eating. If you're not fasting at least 12 hours, it's just considered regular eating. A common thing you'll hear with time-restricted eating is 16-8. That means you have a fasting window of 16 hours and an 8-hour eating window. We'll talk more about how long that eating window should be a little later, but that's time-restricted eating. Set windows of time in a 24-hour period that you eat or fast. Now, I mentioned I would come back to Ramadan. This is a month where Muslims refrain from eating and drinking anything from sunrise to sunset. It would basically be considered a form of time-restricted eating since, depending on where you live, sunrise to sunset can be quite a long fast, usually over 12 hours. However, it really puts that fasting window in the middle of waking hours, as opposed to a typical time-restricted eating pattern in which the fasting window is tied to sleep. So you're fasting a little bit before you sleep, during sleep, and a little after you wake in a typical pattern. So Ramadan is a specific circumstance that we're not going to cover in today's episode, since placing that fasting window in the middle of the day is not going to be ideal for most people long term. Lastly, you have a few less common fasting approaches like OMAD, which stands for 1 meal a day, where people consume their food in a very small window, such as only 2 hours per day, or they just consume a single large meal per day. There's also the warrior diet, which incorporates some aspects of intermittent fasting, but this is not something that I can get on board with. So we're not going to talk about these incredibly restrictive types of fasting, like dry fast, OMAD, or the warrior diet, since today we're focusing on feasible and reasonable approaches to use fasting for health. With fasting and the different types of fasting defined, the next question is, why would someone want to fast? Why has there been this explosion in the popularity of different approaches to fasting in the last 10 to 15 years? I think there are a lot of reasons these approaches have gained popularity. For one, people generally find intermittent fasting approaches pretty easy to follow and pretty easy to stick with in the longer term. Many people find it a lot easier to just not eat during a certain time period than to control their food intake or their portions or decide what to eat when they are eating. And studies show that just by reducing the amount of time in a day that you eat, doing that time-restricted eating, people naturally reduce the number of calories they eat, often up to 500 calories less per day. So that's one, it's pretty easy. Another is that many of the benefits that have been shown for intermittent fasting don't require you to count calories, or at least not as much as a typical reduced calorie diet would. Simply shortening the number of hours you consume calories in a day can afford some metabolic benefits, even if you don't end up reducing the number of calories you eat. We'll get more into the specific benefits later, but in general, doing alternate day fasting or time-restricted eating is likely going to help you lose some weight, lose an inch or two around your waist, slightly improve your blood pressure. You may see improvements in blood lipids like triglycerides and cholesterol. Reductions in fasting insulin and improvements in insulin sensitivity are often observed, and general decreases in inflammation have also been shown. Often, these benefits are not drastic. It's a few pounds of weight loss or fat loss, a few points decrease in blood pressure, but also often, the differences that are seen are when these approaches are compared to a reduced calorie diet. So we're seeing benefits above and beyond standard calorie restriction. The studies show you can have some metabolic benefit with little effort. And hey, who doesn't like some benefit for little effort? And the more effort you do put in, typically the longer your fasting windows or the more stringently you follow an intermittent fasting plan, the better the outcomes. Also, as is often the case, larger improvements can be seen in those who have more room to change. If your total or LDL cholesterol is high, you'll likely see a greater improvement than someone with cholesterol already in the healthy range. I like intermittent fasting because there's such a range of options you can work within to find something that works for you. So let's get into some key questions and considerations for putting intermittent fasting into practice. One of the first questions people will ask is, what breaks a fast? We mentioned earlier, if you're doing a strict fast, then you're sticking to only water, or there's that less strict interpretation where you can have non-caloric beverages like unsweetened tea and coffee, but basically avoiding anything with calories in it. However, some studies have been done where they let participants consume a teaspoon of sugar and a teaspoon of cream in their coffee, and they still saw many of the benefits we've discussed. So this is one of those things that can be on the spectrum. It would be better to stick with beverages that do not contain calories in your fasting period. But if you have something with up to about 20 calories, it's not going to completely obliterate your benefits. So if we're sticking to the 20 calorie or less rule, you could add a very small amount of sweetener, cream, or milk to your beverage and still be effectively fasting. People can get really technical when it comes to this, but whether or not you're breaking your fast also kind of depends on the purpose behind why you're fasting. If you're fasting to give your entire digestive system a break, well, putting anything in your system that activates digestion would then break that fast. If you're fasting to keep your blood sugar low and insulin levels low for an extended period of time, then black coffee, tea, or even sipping something with 20 calories in it over an extended period of time is not going to take you out of the fast for that purpose. So just like everything in nutrition, it's going to be individualized. What breaks a fast will depend in part on your physiology, the purpose of your fast, and the effects of what you do consume on your glucose, insulin, digestion, your circadian rhythms, and more. Still, aside from those caveats we just discussed, there are certainly things that are more black and white when it comes to breaking a fast. Calorie-containing beverages like juice, milk, soda, and food consumed in more than a tiny amount, those are all going to break a fast. We're not going to go down this rabbit hole of fat fasting, so if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. But if you eat food or you consume a beverage with more than about 20 calories, you're breaking your fast. Also, alcohol will break a fast. Those are the general rules around what you can have or not have during a fasting period. The next question is, how long should I fast? If you're new to fasting, I definitely recommend starting slow and working your way up. Most people aren't going to have a problem with fasting for 12 hours because maybe 7 or 8 of those hours you're hopefully sleeping. So aside from the groups that we'll talk about later who should not fast in any capacity, starting with time-restricted eating and a 12-hour eating window, 12-hour fasting window should be feasible for most people. Eating any longer than a 12-hour window is just considered normal eating. In fact, studies estimate adults in the US typically eat about 13 to 15 hours a day. One study found that less than 10% of adults eat within a 12-hour window. So aiming for 12 hours of fasting is a great place to start, and you can slowly work your way up to fasting longer from 12 hours up to 16, 18 hours max for the time-restricted eating approach. I mentioned earlier the 16-8 is a common approach in time-restricted eating, 16 hours of fasting and an 8-hour eating window per day. 16-8 is commonly used in a lot of the studies that have been done on time-restricted eating, but that eating window can range from about 6 hours on the low end to 12 hours on the high end. Once your body is accustomed to going through longer periods of time without food, you could venture into some of the alternate fasting approaches if desired. Next question, specific to time-restricted eating. Does it matter where you put that eating window within the day? The answer is yes, it matters. And that's again going to be on a spectrum where to answer the best eating window timing, we have to briefly talk about our circadian rhythms and clock genes. About 80% of the genes in our body are on a 24-hour schedule, what's called a circadian rhythm. We have a master clock that regulates things like our sleep-wake cycle, and that master clock and clock genes regulate the circadian rhythms of many functions in our bodies like digestion, hormone release, and body temperature. This internal schedule is present in every cell and organ, and it creates this program for every cell or organ to do certain things at certain times. You can kind of think of it as a light switch. Certain genes turn on or off at certain times throughout a 24-hour cycle. And when those switches are working properly, we have health, and when they're not working properly, we have negative health effects. Our internal clocks are very sensitive to light. That's one of the strongest influences, or the strongest influence. But food intake and timing also influences these clocks within our cells and organs. So back to the question of when you should put your eating window if you're doing time-restricted eating. Experts in the field of circadian biology suggest that the body is not ready to optimally respond to food intake in the first few hours after waking. Similarly, digestion and important hormones for responding to food, like insulin, function better earlier in the day versus later in the evening. So with those two statements, it seems an ideal eating window would start 2 or more hours after waking and end several hours before you go to bed. Another thing to consider about eating too close to bedtime is that the process of digestion takes many hours. To fully empty the stomach of food can take between 2 and 4 hours, and then that food spends many more hours in the small intestine for digestion and absorption. And we know many important processes need to occur while you sleep. We'll touch on those a little bit later. But if you're not getting into a good fasted state while you sleep because you ate a huge meal too close to when you went to bed, your body is not going to do a lot of those important regenerative processes that happen while you sleep. So what's the consequence of that? You wake up not feeling rested. You don't clear waste buildup products in your body and your brain. Your brain doesn't function as well, and you increase your risk of cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases. These are important processes that need to occur while we sleep. So putting that last bite of food many hours prior to sleep should be a goal for all of us, whether you're doing any of these fasting approaches or not. All that said, let's answer the question. If you're doing time-restricted eating, when should you put your eating window? Well, if we go with the commonly used 8-hour eating window and you wake up at 7 a.m. regularly, consuming your first calories or breaking your fast sometime between 9 to 11 a.m. and taking your last bite of food or calories in beverage form by 5 to 7 p.m. will give you a few hours for your systems to get up and running in the morning and several hours for your body to digest your last food before bed. Even with a 10-hour eating window, you could fit that between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. and still have those buffers between waking and sleeping. And if you wake up earlier or later than 7 a.m., you could shift those examples I gave accordingly. Also, in relation to our circadian rhythms, you do want to try to keep your eating times relatively consistent. Meaning, if you set your eating window as 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. each day, you really don't want to waver too much from that and all of a sudden eat at 7 a.m. one day or late night eat to 11 p.m. This comes back to food intake influencing our clocks. When you typically eat at certain times, your body begins to anticipate food at those times and prepare the systems to process that food. If you eat earlier than your normal time, your digestive processes might not work as well, and you may feel some digestive symptoms. You've probably heard it's better to go to bed and wake up at about the same time every day, even on the weekends, right? That's because of your circadian clocks, and the same is true for consuming food. Your body will handle the food better with a consistent schedule and considering those buffers after waking and before bed that we talked about. So, if you do try out time-restricted eating, or if you've already been practicing it, try to keep your eating window consistent. And if you do need to change it for some reason, shift it slowly over a few days. For instance, if you wanted to change from an 8-hour eating window to a 10-hour eating window, you can move your start eating time by about 30 minutes for a few days, then another 30 minutes for a few days until you get to your goal. Slowly adjusting changes to your eating and even your sleep schedule will allow your internal clocks and your hormones to adjust better. Now that we've covered some basics about circadian rhythms, how does that fit into alternate day fasting? Because we just said it's important to be consistent with your eating window to help entrain those internal clocks. It seems contradictory then to suggest alternate day fasting where one day you don't eat anything or very low calorie, and then another day you eat whatever you want. Seems like that might wreak havoc on your clocks and in turn your digestive ability. So there are a few potential solutions here if you do want to try alternate day fasting, modified alternate day fasting, or the 5-2 approach. One, if you plan to do any of these approaches, aim to do them consistently for a period of time and not haphazardly. 2, aim to keep your eating start and stop time consistent on the days that you do eat. If you're doing modified alternate day or 5-2, you're still consuming calories on your fasting days. It's just that low amount of 500 to 600 calories. So in that case, you'll still aim to consume your first calories on your low calorie fast day at the same time as your normal routine. Third, especially if you're doing no calorie fast days of just water, coffee, tea, consider breaking your fast on the eating day with a small and easily digestible meal or snack to start. This will allow your digestive system to start with something easy and get up and running. Examples could be a broth or vegetable soup, cooked soft vegetables, a little egg or fish for some good quality protein, a little avocado or olive oil for healthy fats. You want to keep it small and include things that you know are going to be easy to digest but give you some nutrients. Things that are not easy to digest include red meat, raw vegetables, dairy, and while simple sugars are easy to digest, you definitely want to avoid these in that initial meal that breaks your fast so you're not causing that big spike in blood sugar. We've now defined different approaches to fasting and discussed the general principles of each. Let's look at what benefits have been shown for intermittent fasting approaches. If you see any stories about fasting in the news, you're probably not getting the whole story. People complain that scientists are changing their messaging about certain topics, but in reality, a lot of times, the media coverage of certain topics was wrong or too simplified to begin with. People take a catchy headline and run with it, but as we've discussed, there are so many individualized factors in nutrition and health. It matters how the study was conducted, who it was conducted in, what the outcome measures were, what the comparison groups were, and so many other factors. The problem with good science is you're trying to answer a narrow question, a hypothesis, and to do that, you have to narrow your focus. Then people want to take the results and broaden the focus, which doesn't always work. That said, I'll do my best to generalize what's been found with regard to the health benefits of these different fasting approaches while not overreaching. Okay, let's start with true alternate day fasting. There aren't a lot of studies on true alternate day fasting, but of what's there, the results are pretty consistent. ADF can drastically reduce weekly calorie intake, which makes sense since every other day you're not consuming calories. Because of a decent reduction in calories, studies in alternate day fasting in generally healthy people show significant weight loss as well, usually about 2 pounds per week. This is accompanied by reductions in fat mass, but also, unfortunately, with some loss of lean mass as well, which we don't want because that basically means we're losing some muscle. Small but meaningful decreases in blood pressure are seen, mainly more in that first number, the systolic blood pressure, than the diastolic. And changes in blood lipids like total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and triglycerides, those were somewhat mixed. Some studies showed slight benefits, but in general, there wasn't much change in the lipid profiles or in glucose or insulin measures, at least in shorter-term studies of a few weeks. However, a study comparing people who had done alternate day fasting for at least 6 months compared to healthy controls did find improvements in lipid profiles. So it might be an issue of time. A review of many clinical studies using mainly modified alternate day fasting, where 25% of daily caloric needs was consumed on the fasting day, they saw similar results to more stringent alternate day fasting. They found significant reductions in body weight, fat mass, systolic and diastolic blood pressure, total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and calorie intake. Unfortunately, they also noted that decrease in lean mass in addition to all of those positive benefits. So those sound pretty familiar to what we've already talked about with alternate day fasting. Most of the benefits are positive, and they're mostly related to calorie reduction, weight loss, fat loss, and cardiovascular outcomes like blood lipids and blood pressure. Most of those studies were in people under the age of 65 and generally healthy, non-obese people. Studies specifically looking at individuals with obesity and/or metabolic syndrome basically found the same things again: weight loss of about 2 pounds per week, reductions in waist circumference, decreases in blood pressure, minor or no changes in glucose levels, and no changes in blood lipids, at least in the shorter time frame of 6 to 8 weeks. Some studies directly compared alternate day fasting protocols or time-restricted eating to a standard diet of just reduced calorie intake. For the most part, fasting approaches showed more positive outcomes for body weight, fat loss, and some lipid outcomes compared to a regular calorie-reduced diet. Some studies, specifically in time-restricted eating, do show improvements in fasting glucose, insulin, and insulin sensitivity measures after longer interventions. This points to the fact that many shorter-term interventions of 4, 8, even 12 weeks may not fully capture the benefits of doing a fasting approach longer term. But generally, when comparing fasting protocols to a standard diet or a protocol where calories are not reduced in either group, they're just comparing fasting or time-restricted eating with a standard eating pattern, we see marginally better effects for weight loss, fat loss, and improvements in other metabolic parameters, which really does suggest there's something more going on in our bodies when we go for an extended period of time without consuming food. What more mechanistic studies in this area have found is that intermittent fasting impacts the expression of clock genes, which can have a wide range of beneficial effects on metabolism and related processes like digestion and inflammation. One of the really important mechanistic aspects of fasting I do want to touch on is a process called autophagy. This is a process responsible for cleaning up dead cells or cells and proteins that are damaged or sick. It's really important for optimal health, and we know that autophagy is suppressed in the presence of nutrients. So when we're in the fed state, this housekeeping process is not occurring much. We need to be in a fasted state to access the full benefits of autophagy, and this process is also more active during sleep when many of our restorative processes occur. These repair mechanisms and cleaning up of waste and bad cells are all controlled by circadian genes, those clock genes. So here's where we get into the potential brain benefits of fasting. By better regulating our circadian rhythms through fasting and being in a more fasted state when we approach bedtime, as we discussed, we're optimizing these important restorative processes that occur during sleep and that are important for clearing out accumulated waste products in the brain that contribute to brain function and likely are going to reduce the risk of certain neurodegenerative conditions. Now, I said I wasn't going to go too deep on the mechanistic side today, but all of this stuff is really fascinating and exciting. So I did just want to mention a few other potential mechanisms that may contribute to the many benefits we observe with fasting. Many of them have to do with regulating our circadian rhythms, including those of DNA repair enzymes, liver enzymes and function, and digestive processes. Studies in animal models suggest we have gut microbiome changes that might even result in less absorption of some fat and sugar. This could explain why we see better outcomes of weight loss, even when caloric intake between two groups seems to be the same. Circadian biology is incredibly complex, and it affects so many things in our lives, from our sleep-wake cycles to even how our body responds to medications because of those gene on-off switches we discussed earlier. It's what causes jet lag and makes us feel like crap around daylight savings time, right? But it's something we don't think often about in relation to when we eat food. Every time we eat or don't eat, we're influencing our circadian biology. Now, I've told you all the amazing things about fasting and how it works. I also have to tell you who shouldn't fast, or at least circumstances you should approach incorporating fasting with caution. These types of fasting approaches that we've talked about are not appropriate for children, pregnant or nursing women, those with a current or recurrent infection, people with eating disorders or a history of eating disorders, people who are underweight, or people with heart failure. And it's likely not a fit for people with type 1 diabetes, certain cancers, or people over 70. Obviously, if you have a medical condition, your circumstances are unique, and you should work with a healthcare professional like a registered dietitian who can tailor a healthy plan for you. But let's talk about why we say no fasting in some of these instances. Pregnant and nursing women. The main reason is this largely hasn't been studied. Obviously, throughout history, lots of women have probably gone extended periods without consuming food while pregnant and still had babies. But we're trying to optimize the health of the baby and the mother, so ensuring that both have consistent and adequate nutrition is important. Breastfeeding also greatly increases energy demands on the female body, so fasting is not advised during this time. I don't know that I need to explain the kids and no fasting thing, but some people might argue it's perfectly fine and even natural for kids to fast. And that's probably true, but I think a better focus would be teaching kids healthy habits around food, instilling the importance of a variety of healthy fruits, vegetables, whole grains every day, and minimizing unhealthy food choices. And part of that can be teaching moderation and that we don't always need to be eating and snacking all day, particularly at night. So while some of that might overlap with fasting principles, we shouldn't be promoting or focusing or implementing any fasting protocols specifically in kids and teens. You heard me mention as well a small loss of lean mass or muscle mass a few times. Any weight loss can cause loss of lean muscle too. So particularly if you don't have muscle mass to lose, if you're an older individual, you want to try to offset any loss of lean mass. And there are a couple of approaches to do that. One, make sure you're getting adequate protein on your eating days, increasing to 1.6 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. And on your fasting days, if you're doing modified alternate day fasting, aim for a significant number of those 500 to 600 calories to be from protein. Second, there's some evidence to suggest protein earlier in the day can help maintain muscle mass. So make sure you consume protein with that first meal for sure. If you're really concerned about your muscle mass, go for a longer eating window, such as 10 or 12 hours instead of 8. One study in 828 older adults with an average age of 76 showed that a longer eating window was associated with greater muscle mass. And this rule doesn't just apply for older individuals. If you're trying to gain muscle mass, extending your eating window up to that 12-hour maximum can help make sure you're getting adequate protein in. Similar to the last episode, if you're taking any medications, you have to acknowledge how fasting might affect that medication and its effects, something that you should discuss with your doctor. Some medications need to be taken with food or at a certain time of the day. So if you need to take a medication with food in the morning, you'll have to figure out how to do that with your feeding window. Similar to the effects of the DASH diet we reviewed in the last episode, because intermittent fasting can improve blood pressure, if you're on blood pressure medication, we don't want your blood pressure to drop too low. So coordinate with your healthcare provider to monitor your blood pressure and discuss your plan for dietary changes. Type 2 diabetics on insulin, same scenario, because of those potential changes in blood sugar and insulin levels with extended fasting, unless you wear a continuous glucose monitor to know where your blood sugar levels are at any given time, you should definitely be coordinating changes with your prescriber. If you've had a recent cardiovascular event, like a heart attack, fasting is not recommended. It's also not recommended if you have a history of an eating disorder. However, in healthy individuals, these types of fasting approaches have not been shown to induce disordered eating or alter eating behaviors or tendencies negatively. I've heard some people say that fasting is disordered eating, and I disagree with that statement. I think if you're doing it with purpose and understanding of the mechanisms, it can be a perfectly healthy thing to incorporate into your lifestyle. Specific to women and women's hormones and cycles, unfortunately, there just aren't a lot of studies looking specifically at female hormones and intermittent fasting. There was a small study in China looking at women with PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and time-restricted eating. And they found improvements in fasting insulin and insulin resistance, which occur often with PCOS. They also found improved menstrual cycle regularity and positive changes in the hormones that contribute to some of those problems in PCOS, like hyperandrogenemia, which is too high of some of the androgenic hormones. But they found no changes in luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, or the LH-FSH ratio. The biggest thing, in my opinion, is to listen to your body and monitor your cycle. If you experience changes or cessation of your period while trying any dietary change, not just fasting, that's something you need to discuss with your healthcare provider. Other signs fasting might not be working for you include increased insomnia, increased anxiety, or unexplained changes in your menstrual cycle. Some, like Dr. Mindy Pelz, have suggested the follicular phase that starts on the first day of your period and continues about 14 days. They say that's a good time to do your regular fasting routine. You may need to back off a few days at the start of menstruation, but then the rest of that 2-week time is a good time for fasting. In the second half of your cycle, about days 15 to 28, you may need to shorten your fasting window progressively leading up to your next period. It kind of goes back to listening to your body. There are some plausible reasons why fasting might be easier in the first 2 weeks of your cycle and harder in the second 2 weeks, based on the hormonal shifts that are happening. So you can experiment with slowly shortening your fasting window in that second half of your cycle and then ramping back up a few days after the start of your period, and see if you feel better or worse doing it that way versus keeping your eating window consistent. As for hormonal balance, this is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And the truth is, getting back to those basics that we talked about in the first 2 episodes, focusing on a balanced diet of high quality whole foods, lots of fruits and vegetables, good sources of proteins, and healthy fats. Those things, along with moving your body more, getting good physical activity, those are going to move the needle the most with regard to optimizing hormones and overall health. Stress reduction is another one that we haven't talked much about, but stress can have a major impact as well. So without going into much detail on the topic of stress, incorporating stress reduction techniques like exercise, breathing exercises, and the like will also support optimal hormone levels. For men, also not a lot of studies looking at hormonal changes at this point, but the evidence that's there does point to some potential decreases in free and total testosterone up to about 25%. Does this matter? Well, I think it depends on your baseline, your starting point, your goals, your lifestyle. So if you're concerned about your testosterone level as a male, you could work with a healthcare provider, or there are also a lot of these at-home test kits now that you can monitor your testosterone levels over time. You could also consider that longer eating window. The effects of the reduction in testosterone I mentioned, those have all been shown in 8-hour time-restricted eating protocols. So consider a longer window and keeping track. What about nutrition shortfalls? Some people have said if you reduce your eating window, you might not get the calories and nutrients you need. Well, for one, there are very few of us who need to be concerned about getting enough calories. Those would mainly be people who are very active or older individuals that need to maintain body weight, especially muscle mass. So as long as you're eating a varied diet, there's no concern that's specific to not getting certain nutrients with intermittent fasting. That will depend more on the specific foods you're eating. Like we mentioned, watching out for vitamin B12 if you're not consuming a lot of animal products and such. If you're concerned about getting enough of certain vitamins and minerals, you can definitely add a multivitamin or individual supplement for those nutrients, but in general, it's not a concern simply from a fasting standpoint, at least not the approaches we've focused on today. Are there any side effects? Intermittent fasting is generally safe for most people. I mean, if you really think about it, it hasn't been that long in our history that we've had such access to food. Our bodies are very capable of managing energy and fuel to keep us functioning in times of low or no food. So while there may be some initial side effects such as hunger, mood fluctuations, headache, and fatigue, those generally tend to be mild and reduce over time. Blood sugar dropping too low, called hypoglycemia, is more of a concern in people with type 1 or type 2 diabetes. However, it can occur in anyone. Symptoms of low blood sugar include shakiness, sweating, irritability, dizziness, headache, and blurred vision, among others. So if you do experience these symptoms, that's your body telling you to eat something. It's important to listen to your body in these situations. A small snack with a little bit of carbohydrate will help, but also starting with that less fasting time, starting with 12 hours of fasting, will help your body adjust. That's why it's important to start slower and work your way up to longer fasting periods. That wraps up our discussion of circumstances where you would need to approach fasting with more caution and some specific considerations for different groups of people. Now let's review the general do's and don'ts of these intermittent fasting approaches and how best to put these ideas into practice. The first step is going to be choosing your approach. Will you do one of the alternate day fasting approaches? And will you do a strict water, coffee, tea fast on your fast days? Or will you do the modified version where you can consume about 25% of your calories, about 500 to 600 calories on those fasting days? Will you do strict every other day or the 5-2 approach where you only have to do the low calorie days twice a week? If you're new to fasting, I would recommend starting instead with time restricted eating approach where you can choose that eating window anywhere between 6 to 12 hours, starting at the higher end closer to 12 hours and working your way towards an 8-hour eating window. As for consistency, if you're following your fasting approach at least 5 to 6 days of the weeks, studies still show benefits. However, the more consistent, the better, due to all of those things we talked about with the setting of your circadian rhythms. Also related to those rhythms, aim to let your system get up and running in the morning by waiting at least 1, but preferably more like 2 to 3 hours after waking before you break your fast. Similarly, give your body time to digest your last meal before you go to bed, with at least 3 hours no food before bed. But even more than 3 hours will put you closer to that fasted state before bed, which will help you reap the benefits of autophagy and other restorative processes during sleep. Does it matter whether your eating window is earlier or later in the day? Well, you're going to get the benefits either way, but earlier windows do seem to be a bit better than later eating windows if that works for you. But it's a balance, right? An 8-hour eating window between maybe 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. would allow you to eat dinner with your family and have a somewhat normal schedule. So you have to pick what's going to work for you. A few other things to think about here. 1, acid reflux can be worsened by caffeine intake, especially on an empty stomach. So while you can drink things like black coffee and tea in a fasting period, if you have issues with acid reflux or you notice them after you start fasting, consider putting your caffeine intake closer to or at the start of your eating window to reduce this. Remember, you also want to ease back into food after a longer fast, eating a smaller, simple meal to let your digestive system rev up again. Aim to avoid simple carbohydrates and simple sugars most of the time in general, but especially as you break a fast so that you don't majorly spike your blood sugar levels. What about exercise? There are a variety of opinions on this matter. Again, it really depends on your circumstances and your goals. If you're doing very physically taxing, high-intensity exercise, you probably want to do that during your feeding window so you can have some energy before your exercise session and some energy after. Some people have no problem exercising while fasted, but there's good evidence that our circadian rhythms prefer exercise. There's maybe slightly more benefit to exercise. It's a little bit easier later in the day as opposed to earlier. But given that the most important thing with physical activity is to do it, is to get that exercise in, I want you to consider that first. When can you do the exercise? And then if you're flexible, you can incorporate some of these other suggestions, such as moving it later in the day. If the only time you can work out is very early in the morning and you still want to be fasting in that time, you may need to consider adjusting your exercise program accordingly. Another question is, do you need an app to track your fasting time? I would say generally no. If you're sticking with that consistent start and end time that we've recommended, you don't need an app to tell you how long you've been fasting. I've tried a few of them, and this is more of another thing to think about, to log, to get notified on your phone, and who really needs more notifications on our phones? But if you're really concerned about remembering when to start and stop your window, I would just set up a simple recurring reminder in your phone for your start time and maybe 30 to 60 minutes before your end time so that you remember to get those last calories in before your cutoff. And one last note about that last meal of the day. We know our goal is to be as close as possible to that fasted state when we go to bed. So if you eat a really large meal at the last eating occasion, that's going to take longer to digest than a smaller, lighter meal. Things like going for a short walk after dinner can help your body metabolize that meal faster, but it's just something to think about in terms of the reason we want to stop eating several hours before bed. I think there's some wisdom in the old saying, eat like a king for breakfast, a prince for lunch, and a pauper for dinner. My grandfather used to say that. And that just basically means consume more of your calories earlier in the day, fewer calories later in the day. And that will help get you deeper in that fasted state during sleep, which we know is important for a lot of things. I hope you learned something new about intermittent fasting today, that you have enough information to decide if trying one of these approaches is something you're interested in, and that you have the tools to take the next steps when you're ready. Please leave any questions or comments you have about today's episode in the comments section of our YouTube channel. You can find us at Nuchi Health, that's Nuchi Health, on all social platforms. And if you learned something helpful or enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and/or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. Those interactions are going to help us grow and make a bigger impact. Thank you so much for being here, for your desire to learn and improve your health, and for letting us be part of your health journey. I'll see you soon.